Hello there, and welcome back to Real Conflict Zone. I'm your host, and before we dive into tonight's story, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. Whether you're listening during your morning commute, taking a break from work, or settling in for the night, I appreciate you choosing to spend your time with us. If you're new to the channel, welcome to the community. We explore stories of survival, conflict, and the extraordinary things ordinary people do when pushed to their absolute limits. If you find yourself drawn into what you're about to hear, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. And for those of you who've been with us from the beginning, your support means everything. Now, let's get into tonight's story, and I promise you, this one will challenge everything you think you know about the natural world, about courage, and about what a parent will do when their child is in danger. He entered that jungle to find his daughter. What he found instead was an ancient darkness that had been waiting in the mist for longer than anyone could remember. This is the story of what happened when a special forces officer confronted something that shouldn't exist, something that the locals had learned long ago to fear. This is the story of the King of Shadows. The man's name was Marcus Wellington, though the people who knew him well called him Mark. He was 42 years old, with the kind of bearing that comes from 20 years in special operations, from serving in places that don't appear on most maps and doing things that never make it into official reports. His hair was graying at the temples, cut short in the practical style of someone who'd never had time for vanity. His face was weathered, marked by sun and stress and the accumulated weight of decisions made in circumstances where there was no right answer, only the choice between different kinds of wrong. Mark had spent most of his adult life in environments defined by violence and danger. He'd operated in Iraq and Afghanistan, in Syria and Yemen, in Somalia and a dozen other places that existed in the margins of American military involvement. He'd led teams through urban warfare and desert operations, through jungle ambushes and mountain assaults. He'd trained soldiers and coordinated with intelligence agencies and made calls that determined whether people lived or died. He'd been good at his job, the kind of good that came from combining physical capability with tactical intelligence and an almost supernatural ability to stay calm under pressure. But for the past 3 years, Mark had been trying to be something different. After his last deployment, he'd requested a posting that would keep him stateside, that would allow him to spend more time with his family. The military had accommodated this, not out of sentimentality but because officers with his level of experience were valuable and keeping them in the system was more important than forcing them into situations where they might burn out completely. So Mark had accepted a position at Fort Bragg, coordinating training exercises and mentoring younger officers, work that was steady and important but that lacked the intensity of active deployment. His wife was named Sarah, and they'd been married for 18 years. Sarah was a therapist, worked with clients who had anxiety and PTSD and depression, people whose minds had been damaged by trauma or circumstance. She understood what Mark did for work, understood the toll it took, understood that the man who came home from deployments was sometimes different from the man who'd left. They'd made it work, through careful communication and commitment and the kind of love that doesn't require constant validation. Their daughter was named Emma, and she was 10 years old. Emma had her mother's intelligence and her father's determination, a combination that made her both delightful and occasionally exasperating. She loved books and science, loved building things with her hands, loved the outdoors in that uninhibited way that children do when they haven't yet learned to be afraid of the world. For the past year, Emma had been asking her parents for a family vacation, a chance to do something together, a chance to have her father's attention without the interruptions of work and military obligations. Mark had promised her this vacation for months. He'd started planning it in the fall, had requested time off and marked the dates on his calendar. The plan was to drive up to the Pacific Northwest, to spend 2 weeks exploring the natural beauty of Oregon and Northern California, to camp and hike and spend time together as a family. Sarah was excited about it, Emma was counting down the days, and Mark had actually allowed himself to feel something like anticipation, something like the possibility that he could step away from his work and be just another father on vacation with his family. They'd left Fort Bragg on a Friday morning, right after Mark's last briefing of the week. The plan was to drive north, to make it to their first campsite by evening. They'd rented a vehicle, a sturdy SUV that could handle back roads, and loaded it with camping equipment, food, and supplies. Emma had packed her own bag, had included things like binoculars for bird watching and a field guide to identify plants and animals. The three of them had been in reasonably good spirits as they left, excited about what the next 2 weeks would bring. For the first few days, the vacation had been exactly what they'd hoped for. They'd camped in established campgrounds, hiked well-maintained trails, visited tourist attractions that catered to families. Emma had loved it all, had collected rocks and pressed flowers, had written detailed notes in a journal about the plants and animals she'd seen. Sarah had relaxed in a way that Mark rarely saw, had stopped checking her work email and had been present in a way that suggested how much she needed this break. Even Mark had felt some of the tension leave his shoulders, though some part of him remained vigilant, remained aware of exits and potential threats, remained locked in the patterns of awareness that 2 decades of military service had carved into his nervous system. By the 8th day of the vacation, they'd driven further off the beaten path, heading toward an area that was less developed, less touristy, more genuinely wild. They were in Northern California, in a region where the coastal redwoods gave way to denser forests and the infrastructure of civilization became more sporadic. They'd spent the night at a small lodge in a town called Crescent Mills, and the owner of the lodge had recommended a drive through a particular area, a loop that took you through some of the most pristine forest in the region. The owner had been enthusiastic about the recommendation, had talked about the beauty of the drive, about the way the old-growth forest created a kind of cathedral effect that you couldn't experience anywhere else. She'd given them detailed directions and had warned them about a few things. The road was narrow and winding, you needed to watch for wildlife, and there was a section of the loop that could only be driven during daylight hours because there was no moon that night and the forest was too thick to navigate safely in the dark. That last warning should have registered more clearly, should have caused Mark to pause and reconsider. But it was framed almost casually, as if it were a minor inconvenience rather than something important. And Emma had been so excited about the possibility of seeing old-growth redwoods, of driving through a pristine wilderness area, that Mark had decided the warning was probably just an abundance of caution. They'd left the lodge at midday, and the drive had been spectacular. The forest was incredible, massive trees that had been growing for centuries, ecosystems that were so intact and undisturbed that you felt like you were traveling back in time. Emma had been glued to the window, had requested that they stop several times so she could get out and walk among the trees, could take photos with a camera she'd brought specifically for the trip. Sarah had been enjoying herself as well, though Mark could see her checking her watch periodically, could see her doing mental math about the daylight hours they had remaining. The warning about the daylight-only driving section of the loop had receded from Mark's mind as they'd been driving. They'd been making good time, and he'd estimated they could complete the loop and get back to their lodge by evening, with perhaps an hour or 2 of daylight remaining. The road had been winding but manageable, and aside from the narrowness and the occasional fallen tree that required some maneuvering around, there had been nothing particularly dangerous about the drive. By late afternoon, they'd reached the beginning of the section that the lodge owner had warned them about. There was a banner hanging across the road, made of faded fabric that had clearly been weathering in the elements for months or perhaps years. The banner read, in letters that were barely legible, "Do not enter after dusk. Danger zone. Local authorities do not respond." Mark had seen the banner and had actually slowed the vehicle, had looked at Sarah, had seen the same concern reflected in her face. Emma had read the banner aloud and had asked what it meant, whether they should turn back. For a moment, Mark had considered doing exactly that. The banner was explicit, was clearly meant as a warning, and was not the kind of thing that should be ignored lightly. But then he'd looked at his watch, had looked at the sun's position in the sky, and had done the math. They had at least 3 hours of solid daylight remaining, possibly closer to 4. The section the banner was referring to was supposed to be only about 10 miles long, winding through the thickest part of the old-growth forest. At the speed they were driving, accounting for curves and the need to navigate carefully on the narrow road, they could complete that section in probably 45 minutes to an hour. That would give them more than 2 hours of daylight buffer, more than enough time to safely navigate back to the main road and return to civilization. Mark had been in special operations for 20 years. He'd made decisions under pressure, had calculated risks in situations where the consequences of being wrong could be measured in lives lost. He'd learned to trust his instincts, to recognize when something was genuinely dangerous versus when it was simply unfamiliar or uncomfortable. And right now, his instinct was telling him that the banner was a precaution, that it was probably reflecting some legitimate concern like the road being particularly treacherous in bad light, or perhaps wildlife being more active at night. None of that seemed like an issue if they had 3 or 4 hours of daylight. It was, in retrospect, the kind of calculation that made sense in the moment but that ignored one crucial variable. The information on the banner came from people who had long experience with this particular area and who had presumably put it up because something had happened to justify the warning. Mark's instinct to trust his own calculations had overridden his training to respect local knowledge and warnings. He'd driven under the banner, had turned to Sarah and Emma and said they'd be through this section well before dark. Sarah had looked uncertain but had not objected. Emma had been excited, had said she hoped they'd see some wildlife, had leaned forward to get a better view as the forest seemed to close in around them, the trees becoming denser, the light becoming dimmer as the canopy thickened above the narrow road. For the first several miles, the drive had been exactly as advertised, spectacular, winding through ancient forest, the trees so large and so densely packed that it felt like they were traveling through another world. Emma had remained engaged, had been pointing out interesting plants and formations, had been taking photos. Sarah had been quieter but seemed to be enjoying herself. Mark had been driving carefully, maintaining a steady pace, very much aware that they were on a narrow road with steep drop-offs on one side and dense forest on the other, that any mistake in navigation could result in significant problems. The sun had been lower in the sky than Mark would have preferred, but there had still been several hours of daylight remaining. He'd been estimating their progress against his mental map of the road and had thought they were perhaps 6 or 7 miles into the 10-mile section, which meant they were roughly in the middle and had made good progress. That's when Emma had asked him to pull over so she could get out and look at something she'd seen in the forest, a particular plant that she'd thought might be a specimen of interest. Mark had initially declined, had said they needed to keep moving to make sure they got through this section before dark. But Emma had been persistent in the way that 10-year-olds can be, and Sarah had added her voice, saying it would only take a few minutes and they had plenty of time. Mark had recognized the dynamic. He was being outvoted by his wife and daughter who simply wanted a brief stop. He'd weighed this against his own growing sense of unease, that vague feeling that they should hurry through this section, should not linger. But the feeling was not based on anything concrete, was not based on anything he could articulate, and 2 against 1 had carried the day. He'd pulled the SUV carefully to the side of the narrow road, making sure the vehicle was completely off the pavement and as close to the forest edge as possible. He'd told Emma to stay close to the vehicle, had told her to not wander into the forest, and had told both his wife and daughter to keep an eye on the time. They'd gotten out, and Emma had walked about 20 feet into the forest to examine the plant more closely, while Sarah had stood near the vehicle, stretching her legs and breathing in the cool forest air. Mark had remained in the driver's seat with the engine running. He'd told himself he was being cautious, was making sure the vehicle was ready to leave immediately if needed. In truth, he'd been unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong, that they should not be stopped here, that they needed to keep moving. The feeling had been growing stronger as the sun had sunk lower, as the light had become more golden and the shadows had begun to stretch across the road. They'd been stopped for no more than 5 or 6 minutes when Emma had called out that she'd found the plant and had taken her photos. Mark had been relieved, had told her to head back to the vehicle immediately. Emma had jogged back, still excited about her discovery, and Sarah had climbed back into the passenger seat. Mark had pulled back onto the road without waiting for anyone to fully settle in, had felt a surge of relief at being back in motion. He'd driven faster now, pushing the speed up as much as felt safe on the winding road, very aware that the sun was sinking toward the horizon faster than he would have liked. He'd been doing mental calculations, trying to determine if they could still complete the loop before the light faded completely, or whether they should turn around and go back the way they'd come. The forest had seemed to grow darker, the canopy thickening even more, and Mark had realized that the last stop had cost them more time and daylight than he'd anticipated. They were still several miles from the end of this section, and the light was fading faster than it should have been, the thick forest creating twilight conditions that were ahead of the natural sunset schedule. Sarah had started to look concerned, had asked how much longer until they were through this section. Mark had told her maybe 15 or 20 minutes, had told her they'd be fine, had told her they had enough light remaining. But he'd been aware that he was making this assessment under uncertain conditions, that he might be underestimating how fast the light was fading, that he might be overestimating their speed and progress. Behind them, Emma had been quiet, had seemingly picked up on the slightly tense atmosphere in the vehicle. She'd asked if everything was okay, and Sarah had told her it was fine, they were just trying to make sure they got through the forest before it got too dark. Mark had been aware of the engine sound, of the crunch of tires on the narrow road, of the sound of wind in the trees. And beneath all that, there had been something else, something that his ears had registered but his conscious mind had not quite processed. A sound, very low, almost below the threshold of hearing, like a distant rumble of thunder or the subsonic vibration of something moving through the earth itself. He'd pushed the thought aside, had attributed it to the wind or the vehicle's engine, had focused on the road in front of him. The light was definitely fading faster now, and he'd been thinking that they should have turned back 10 minutes ago, should have recognized the warning on the banner for what it was, not a casual precaution but a genuine warning about a genuine danger. The thought had come too late. The engine had sputtered, had coughed, and then had died. Not in a gradual slowdown but in an abrupt way that suggested something was genuinely wrong, something beyond simple running out of fuel. Mark had tried to restart the vehicle, and the engine had cranked but had not caught. He tried again, and again the engine had cranked but refused to fire. Sarah had made a sound, something between a gasp and a question. Emma had asked what was wrong. Mark had told them the engine was having some trouble, had told them to sit tight while he figured out what was going on. He'd been thinking about what could cause an engine to die like that, thinking about whether they'd hit something on the road, thinking about whether there was some kind of mechanical failure. The vehicle had been coasting as the engine died, and Mark had been able to guide it to the side of the road, had been able to bring it to a stop without crashing into anything. He'd sat there for a moment, thinking, and then had tried the ignition again. The engine had cranked, and this time had actually started to catch, had turned over for a few revolutions, and then had died again. That's when Mark had felt it. A vibration, not from the vehicle but from the ground itself. It had been subtle at first, had been the kind of thing you might miss if you weren't paying attention, but it had been real, had been something solid vibrating through the earth and into the vehicle. And with the vibration had come that sound again, that low subsonic rumble that he'd half heard before. Sarah had felt it too. He'd seen her sit up straighter, had seen her hand move to the door lock, had seen the question forming on her face. Mark had told her to stay calm, had told her it was probably just the forest settling, had told her they needed to figure out what was wrong with the vehicle. He'd gotten out of the driver's seat, had opened the hood to examine the engine. In the fading light, with the thick forest canopy above them, it had been difficult to see much of anything. The engine had looked normal to him, but he wasn't a mechanic, had only basic knowledge of how vehicles worked. He'd checked the obvious things, the battery terminals were clean, the fluid levels were full, there was nothing immediately obviously wrong. The vibration had come again, stronger this time, and it had been accompanied by a new sound, a sound like wind but not wind, like something moving through the forest, displacing the air in a way that created pressure waves that could be felt rather than heard. Mark had closed the hood and had turned back toward the vehicle. He'd been thinking they should lock the doors, should call for help on their cell phone, should stay in the vehicle and wait for whatever this was to pass. He'd had no conscious recognition of what was happening, no clear understanding of what the vibrations and sounds meant, but his hindbrain, the ancient part of his nervous system that had kept humans alive for thousands of years, had been sending very clear signals that something was wrong, that something dangerous was present, that they should make themselves as secure as possible immediately. He'd been walking around the back of the vehicle, had been about to get back into the driver's seat, when everything had changed. The ground had erupted. There was no other word for it. The solid earth, covered with leaves and debris and the accumulated matter of the forest floor, had exploded upward as something had burst through it. The SUV had been lifted off the ground, had been tilted at an angle that should not have been possible for a vehicle to tilt without rolling completely over. Mud and dirt and broken vegetation had scattered everywhere, and in the chaos and dust, Marcus had caught a glimpse of something that his mind had refused to accept. It had been large. Impossibly large. His mind had registered scale in a way that had suggested this thing was not a normal animal, not something that should exist in the conventional natural world. He'd seen what might have been muscle, what might have been scales, what might have been something that reflected light in a way that scales shouldn't. And then there had been motion, a sudden violent motion that had sent the vehicle rolling. The world had tumbled. Metal had screeched against rock. Glass had shattered. The motion had thrown Mark away from the vehicle, had sent him sprawling across the ground, had knocked the breath from his lungs and the sense of up and down from his orientation. He'd been stunned, had not been processing information properly, had been operating in the daze that comes from sudden violent trauma. He'd been trying to figure out if he was injured, had been trying to get his lungs to work, had been trying to understand what had happened. The sound had come then, and it had cut through all of that. A roar, but not a roar like a lion or a tiger, not a sound from any animal that Mark had encountered or studied or conceptualized. This had been deeper than that, more resonant, a sound that had not just been heard through his ears but had been felt through his entire body, a sound that had vibrated in his chest and his bones and had seemingly echoed in his skull. The roar had been loud enough that for a moment it had been almost impossible to process anything else, and in that moment of overwhelming auditory assault, whatever had attacked the vehicle had retreated, had disappeared back into the forest or underground or wherever it had come from. Mark had been lying on his side in the mud and debris, his breathing ragged, his heart rate spiked so high he'd thought his chest might explode. He'd been aware of pain, localized to his ribs and his left shoulder and his head, but not crippling pain, not the sensation of serious injury. He'd been trying to get his mind to work, trying to figure out what had just happened, trying to overcome the shock that was making it difficult to process anything more complex than the immediate moment. The vehicle had been on its side. He'd been able to see that even from his position on the ground. The SUV had been flipped on its driver's side, which meant Sarah and Emma had been thrown around inside the vehicle, had been impacted by the force of the rollover, had been in danger and he had not been there to protect them. That realization had cut through the shock like nothing else could. Mark had gotten to his feet, had moved toward the vehicle despite his injuries, despite not knowing if whatever had attacked them was still nearby. He'd been aware of blood on his face, from a cut above his eye, and he'd been aware of pain in his ribs every time he took a breath, but none of that had mattered compared to the need to get to his wife and daughter. The vehicle had been a twisted wreck. The driver's side door and the roof had been crumpled inward, and the windshield had been shattered. Mark had moved to the side of the vehicle that was facing up, which was the passenger side, and had looked into the destroyed interior. Sarah had been pinned against the driver's seat, the weight of the vehicle holding her in place. Her face had been bloodied, and she'd been conscious but dazed, had been looking at him with an expression that had mingled confusion and relief and fear. Emma had been in the back seat, had apparently crawled into the footwell between the front and back seats, had been huddled there with her arms over her head. When she'd heard her father's voice, she'd looked up, had seen him, and had started to cry. Mark had told them both that they needed to get out of the vehicle immediately, had told them to be careful of the broken glass and the sharp metal edges, had helped Sarah first, had told her to climb out the side of the vehicle toward him, had been ready to catch her if she fell. Sarah had managed to extract herself, had been unsteady on her feet, had been covered in blood from several lacerations but had been conscious and mobile. Emma had been next. She'd been lighter, had been more agile, and had gotten out more quickly than her mother, though she'd been screaming, had been terrified, had been asking what had happened, where the thing was it coming back? Mark had pulled her out of the vehicle and had held her close, had been trying to project calm even as every nerve in his body had been on alert, trying to detect whether that thing was returning. He'd gotten both of them away from the vehicle, had moved them back toward the forest but then had reconsidered, had realized that moving into the forest might be the wrong choice if that creature was in the forest. Instead, he'd moved them back toward the road, had positioned them behind a large boulder that provided at least some cover and some visibility toward the surrounding area. Sarah had been holding Emma, and Emma had been clutching her mother, both of them shaking. Mark had done a quick assessment of injuries. Sarah had various cuts and bruises, had a possible concussion from the impact, but no immediately obvious serious injuries. Emma had injuries to her left arm where broken glass had cut her, and she'd been severely traumatized, but she'd had no obvious broken bones, no signs of internal injuries. Mark's own injuries had become more apparent as the adrenaline had started to wear off. His left ribs had been badly bruised and possibly one or more had been cracked. His shoulder had been separated or badly dislocated. He'd been aware of the joint being out of place, had been in significant pain. His head injury had been more than just the cut above his eye. He'd been concussed, had been aware of a pressure inside his skull, of the world occasionally doubling. But none of that had mattered. What had mattered was that his wife and daughter were alive, were here with him, had not been taken or killed by whatever that thing was. He'd been thinking about what he'd seen, had been trying to create a mental model of it, and had failed. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he'd encountered. It had been too large, too powerful, too far outside the realm of normal nature to fit into any framework he possessed. Sarah had asked him what that was, what had happened, had demanded to know what they should do. Emma had been holding on to her mother so tightly she'd been almost choking her, had been sobbing, had been repeatedly asking if it was coming back. Mark had told them he didn't know what it was, but they needed to stay calm, needed to figure out what to do next. He'd looked at the destroyed vehicle and had realized that driving out of here was not an option. The engine had been mangled, the suspension had been destroyed, the vehicle was nothing more than twisted metal and broken glass. They would have to leave it and attempt to walk out. That's when he'd remembered the warning on the banner. Do not enter after dusk. Danger zone. The warning had not been cautioning against being on the road in the dark because it was hard to navigate. It had been warning against encountering whatever this thing was, whatever creature or entity the locals knew lived in this forest. Mark had taken out his cell phone and had checked for signal. No bars. The thick forest and the dense canopy had blocked the cellular signal. There would be no calling for help, no way to communicate with the outside world. They would have to get out of here on their own, would have to navigate out of this forest on foot, in increasing darkness, with a wife and daughter who were injured and traumatized and terrified. The sun had been sinking lower on the horizon, and the light had been taking on the golden-red quality of late afternoon transitioning into evening. Mark had estimated they had maybe an hour of decent daylight remaining, possibly 2 hours if they were lucky. After that, they'd be navigating in darkness or near darkness through a forest that was home to something that should not exist, something that had just demonstrated it was willing and able to attack their vehicle. Marcus had made his decision. Sarah and Emma were not going to be able to walk out on their own, not in the dark, not with their injuries, not with the fear they were experiencing. He needed to get them somewhere safe, somewhere defensible, somewhere they could wait until daylight, until help arrived. That's when he'd remembered something he'd seen earlier, before they'd stopped to look at the plant. There had been an old structure, barely visible from the road, set back into the forest on one of the turns. It had looked abandoned, had looked like it might be some kind of ranger station or fire lookout from decades past. It had been maybe a quarter of a mile from where they were now, maybe less. If they could get to it, if the structure was still standing and reasonably intact, they could shelter there, could have some protection from whatever was out in the forest. He'd explained this to Sarah, had told her that they needed to move now while they still had some light, had told her to keep Emma close and to follow him. Sarah had objected, had said they should stay with the vehicle, that rescue personnel would find them more easily if they stayed in one location. Mark had told her no, that no one knew they were missing yet, that no one would be looking for them until tomorrow at the earliest, and he was not going to let them spend the night in the open near a destroyed vehicle with something out there that hunted at night. They'd started moving back down the road, back the way they'd come. Mark had positioned himself slightly ahead and to the side, had been trying to project awareness of the environment, had been listening for any sound that might indicate the creature was returning. Sarah had been supporting Emma, who'd been limping slightly from the cuts on her leg. They'd been moving slowly, carefully, and it had felt like forever even though it had probably only been 10 minutes. The light had been fading faster now, the sun dropping below the highest trees, the shadows deepening in the forest. Mark had been starting to worry that they wouldn't make it to the structure, that darkness would overtake them before they could find shelter, when he'd seen it. The structure had been set back from the road, and it had been falling apart. It had been some kind of ranger station, built probably in the 1950s or 1960s, a wooden structure with a pitched roof and a covered porch. The wood had been weathered gray by decades of sun and rain, and the windows had been broken or covered with boards. The door had been hanging partially off its hinges, and the interior had been dark. It had looked abandoned, had looked uninviting, had looked like it might collapse if you looked at it too hard. But it had been shelter, and right now shelter was all they needed. They'd made their way toward it, and Mark had gone ahead to check it out before allowing Sarah and Emma to approach. He'd pushed open the partially broken door and had stepped inside, his eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. The interior had been empty except for debris on the floor and the remnants of what might have been old equipment or furniture. There had been no immediate signs of danger or occupation, and the structure had seemed reasonably solid, at least for the moment. He'd called Sarah and Emma to come inside, had helped them navigate the broken door and the uneven floorboards, had guided them to a back room where there had been a little more protection from the elements and from anything approaching from outside. He'd told them to stay there, had told them not to make any noise, had told Emma in particular that no matter what she heard outside, she was not to scream or make a sound. Then Mark had positioned himself near the window facing the road, had settled in to keep watch. The light had been almost completely gone by then, the sun having dropped below the horizon, leaving only the residual glow of twilight that was rapidly fading. In another 10 minutes, it would be completely dark. In another 10 minutes, it would be night in the forest, and whatever that creature was, that's when it would be most active, most dangerous, most likely to hunt. Mark had looked at his watch and had confirmed his assessment of the time. It was still just before 7 in the evening, which meant that even though the sun had set, there was still the period of twilight that would continue for another 30 minutes or so. After that, full darkness would come, and they would be without artificial light, without the ability to see more than a few feet, without any real defense against something that hunted in the dark. He'd been thinking about the creature, about what he'd seen during those brief seconds when it had attacked the vehicle. His mind had been trying to rationalize what he'd experienced, had been trying to fit it into some known framework, and had failed repeatedly. It had been too large, too powerful, too fundamentally different from anything his military training had prepared him for. In his career, Mark had been trained to fight other humans, had been trained to navigate hostile terrain, had been trained to handle conventional weapons and conventional threats. He'd faced insurgents in Iraq, had faced Taliban fighters in Afghanistan, had faced pirates in Somalia. He'd been trained for human violence and human warfare. But whatever was out there in the forest was not human, was not something that military training was designed to address. That's when he'd heard it. Another roar, distant but unmistakable, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. It had been the same sound he'd heard before, that subsonic rumble that seemed to vibrate through the forest itself. It had been answered by a second roar, or maybe it had been the same creature vocalizing again, it had been hard to tell in the distance and the failing light. Whatever the case, it had confirmed what Marcus had suspected, they were not the only large creatures in this forest, or whatever that thing was had the ability to vocalize in multiple ways. And it had sounded like it was calling, was communicating with something, was sending some kind of signal that traveled through the dark forest like a threat. Sarah had heard it too. She'd come forward from the back room, had put her hand on Mark's shoulder, had asked him what that was. Emma had appeared behind her, had asked if it was the same thing, was it coming back? Mark had told them they didn't know, that they needed to stay quiet and stay alert, that they should try to rest if they could but that he would keep watch. The night had settled in completely by then, the darkness becoming total, broken only by the occasional flash of distant lightning that illuminated the forest in brief, stark detail. Thunder had rumbled in the distance, suggesting a storm was moving in, suggesting that weather conditions were going to make their situation even worse before it got any better. Mark had continued to keep watch through the long night, listening to every sound, alert for any indication that the creature was approaching. He'd heard various sounds: wind moving through the trees, the distant crash of something heavy moving through the forest, the call of night birds or animals, the sound of rain beginning to fall. But he'd not heard the creature return to the area immediately around their shelter, and he'd taken that as a small mercy. Around 3 in the morning, with the night at its deepest, Marcus had finally allowed himself to rest slightly, had allowed his hypervigilance to drop to a lower level, knowing that Sarah and Emma would need him to be at least somewhat functional for whatever was coming next. He'd found himself drifting in and out of a state that was too conscious to be sleep but too relaxed to be full alertness. At some point, he'd dozed off completely, had lost awareness of his surroundings, had entered the deep darkness of sleep without dreams. He'd woken abruptly to the first light of dawn, had realized he'd left himself undefended, had immediately scrambled to check on Sarah and Emma. They'd been fine, had been huddled together in the back room, had been asleep as well. Emma had been holding her mother, and Sarah had had her arm around their daughter. They'd both looked small and fragile in the early morning light, had looked exhausted and traumatized but had been alive. Mark had stood for a moment, had allowed himself to feel the relief of that simple fact, and then had begun thinking about what came next. They needed to get out of this forest, needed to find civilization, needed to get help. But more than that, they needed to understand what had happened, needed to know what that creature was and why it had attacked them. He'd moved to the window again and had looked out at the road. The morning light had been gray and pale, filtered through heavy clouds that suggested the storm from last night had not fully passed. The forest had looked different in the daylight, less menacing but no less dense, no less capable of hiding something enormous within its depths. That's when he'd heard Emma scream. Mark had spun around, had been moving toward the back room before his conscious mind had fully processed the sound. Emma had been standing near the broken window at the back of the structure, had been pointing at something in the forest, her face white with terror. Sarah had grabbed her and had pulled her away from the window, but Mark had moved to see what his daughter had seen. In the forest, perhaps 50 yards from their shelter, there had been something moving. Not the creature itself but signs of its passage, trees swaying without wind, the ground disturbed in a pattern that suggested something massive moving just beneath the surface or pushing through the undergrowth in a way that displaced everything around it. And then, for just a moment, Mark had seen it. The creature had been partially visible through a gap in the trees, and what Mark had seen had defied every biological principle he understood. It had been covered in something that looked like scales but moved like muscle, had been colored in shades that seemed to shift and blend with the forest itself, making it almost impossible to track visually. Its size had been staggering, easily 20 feet tall at what might have been its shoulder, with a body that extended back into the forest in a way that suggested this thing was far larger than even that initial impression indicated. For a moment, the creature had paused, and Mark had felt certain it was aware of them, was looking directly at their shelter. Then it had moved again, had disappeared back into the forest with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large, leaving only disturbed vegetation and the fading sound of its passage. Emma had been hyperventilating, had been on the verge of a full panic attack. Sarah had been trying to calm her, but Sarah herself had been shaking, had been barely holding herself together. Mark had moved back from the window and had made a decision. They could not stay here. The creature knew where they were, or at least knew this area. Staying in one location made them predictable, made them vulnerable. They needed to move, needed to try to get out of this forest while they still had daylight, while they still had the ability to see threats coming. He'd explained this to Sarah, had told her they were leaving immediately, that they would follow the road back the way they'd come, that they would move as quickly as Emma could manage with her injuries. Sarah had started to argue, had started to say they should wait for rescue, but Mark had cut her off. No one was coming. No one knew they were here. The banner had been explicit: local authorities do not respond. They were on their own, and they needed to get out before nightfall brought the creature back. They'd gathered what little they had prepared to leave. Mark had checked Emma's injuries, had used strips torn from his shirt to bandage the worst of the cuts, had given her what little pain medication they had in their emergency kit. Sarah had been moving stiffly, had been favoring her left side, but had been determined to keep up. They'd left the shelter just after 8 in the morning, had stepped back out onto the road, and had begun walking. The road had stretched ahead of them, winding back through the forest, disappearing into the mist that had settled overnight and had not yet burned off. Mark had positioned himself in front, had kept Sarah and Emma close behind him, had been scanning constantly for any sign of the creature. The walk had been slow and painful. Emma had been limping badly, and after the first half hour, Sarah had been struggling as well. Mark's own injuries had been screaming at him, the pain in his ribs making every breath an exercise in controlled suffering, but he'd pushed through it, had kept them moving. They'd been walking for perhaps 2 hours when they'd heard it again. That roar, that subsonic rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, that vibrated through the ground and through their bones. It had been closer this time, had been close enough that Mark had felt the pressure wave from it wash over them. He'd told Sarah and Emma to move faster, had told them they needed to run if they could. Emma had tried, had hobbled forward as quickly as her injured leg would allow. Sarah had been supporting her, had been half-carrying their daughter, and Mark had been looking behind them, had been watching the forest for signs of pursuit. The creature had burst from the forest not behind them but ahead of them, had emerged from the undergrowth in a location that should have been impossible, that suggested it had somehow circled around them or had been tracking them from multiple positions. This time, Mark had gotten a clear view of it in daylight, and what he'd seen had frozen him in place for a crucial second. The creature had been serpentine in some ways, had possessed a long body that moved in sections like a massive snake or dragon. But it had also had limbs, multiple limbs that seemed to serve different purposes, some for locomotion and others for manipulation. Its head had been triangular and massive, with eyes that reflected light in a way that suggested intelligence, suggested awareness beyond simple animal instinct. And it had been looking directly at Emma. Mark had reacted without thinking, had thrown himself between the creature and his daughter, had raised his arms in a futile gesture of protection. The creature had paused, had tilted its massive head in what might have been curiosity or calculation, and then had opened its mouth to reveal rows of teeth that seemed designed for crushing rather than cutting. The roar that came from that mouth had been deafening, had been so loud and so close that Mark had felt his eardrums protest, had felt the pressure wave knock him backward. But it had not been an attack, had been something else, something that Mark's hindbrain had recognized as a warning or a challenge. Then the creature had done something unexpected. Instead of attacking, it had reached out with one of its forelimbs, had moved with surprising precision, and had grabbed Emma. The movement had been so fast that neither Sarah nor Mark had been able to react in time. One moment Emma had been standing next to her mother, and the next she had been lifted into the air, held gently but firmly in the creature's massive claw. Emma had screamed, had struggled, but the creature had held her with what seemed like careful restraint, as if it understood its own strength and was deliberately not harming her. Sarah had lunged forward, had tried to reach their daughter, but Mark had grabbed her, had held her back even as his own instinct screamed at him to attack the creature. The creature had looked at Emma, had brought her closer to its massive face, and then had done something that Mark's mind had refused to process properly. It had seemed to sniff her, had seemed to be examining her, and then it had made a sound that was different from the roar, a lower sound that almost resembled something like satisfaction or recognition. Then it had turned and had begun moving back into the forest, carrying Emma with it. Sarah had broken free from Mark's grip, had been screaming their daughter's name, had been running after the creature even though it was moving far faster than any human could follow. Mark had chased after Sarah, had caught up to her 20 yards into the forest, had tackled her to the ground to stop her from following the creature deeper into its territory. Sarah had been fighting him, had been screaming at him to let her go, to let her save their daughter. Mark had held her down, had been yelling that they couldn't fight it, that following it into the forest was suicide, that they needed to think, needed to plan. But even as he'd been saying these things, his mind had been fragmenting, had been unable to process the fact that his daughter had just been taken by something that should not exist. They'd lain there on the forest floor for what might have been seconds or minutes, both of them in shock, both of them trying to comprehend what had just happened. When Mark had finally released Sarah, she'd rolled away from him, had curled into a ball, had been making sounds that were too broken to be called crying. Mark had gotten to his feet, had looked in the direction the creature had gone, and had made a decision that he knew was probably going to get him killed but that he could not avoid making. He was going after Emma. He was going to track that creature to wherever it had taken his daughter, and he was going to bring her back, or he was going to die trying. Sarah had looked up at him, had seen the determination on his face, and had started to protest. Mark had told her no, that this was not negotiable, that she needed to continue following the road back, needed to get to civilization, needed to get help. He would go after Emma, would follow the creature's trail, would do whatever it took to get their daughter back. Sarah had refused, had said she was coming with him, that Emma was her daughter too. Mark had told her that one of them needed to survive this, needed to get help, needed to make sure that if something happened to him and Emma, at least someone would know what happened here. He'd told her that she was injured, that she couldn't keep up in a pursuit through dense forest, that she would slow him down and potentially get them all killed. The argument had been brief and brutal and had ended with Sarah understanding that Mark was right, that her best chance to save Emma was to get to civilization and bring back help, even though every instinct in her body was screaming at her to follow her daughter. She'd made Mark promise he would bring Emma back, would not take unnecessary risks, would not throw his life away. Mark had promised. Knowing that he was likely lying, that he would take any risk necessary to get their daughter back. They'd separated there in the forest. Sarah had turned back toward the road, had started the long walk back to civilization, moving as fast as her injuries would allow. Mark had turned deeper into the forest, had begun following the trail the creature had left, a trail that was surprisingly obvious despite the creature's size and power. The tracking had been unlike anything Mark had done in his military career. The creature moved in ways that defied normal physics, left signs that suggested it traveled both on the surface and beneath it, disturbed the environment in patterns that seemed deliberately designed to confuse pursuit. But Mark had 20 years of tracking experience, had learned from the best trackers in the special operations community, and he'd been motivated by something far more powerful than professional pride or mission completion. He'd followed the trail for hours, moving through terrain that grew progressively more difficult, more remote, more fundamentally alien to human presence. The forest had changed as he'd gone deeper, had become denser and darker, had taken on qualities that suggested this was old growth that had never been logged, had never been significantly disturbed by human activity. By late afternoon, Mark had reached an area that the trail seemed to lead toward with increasing consistency. There had been a rock formation ahead, a natural wall of stone that rose up out of the forest floor, perhaps 80 feet high, covered in moss and vegetation but fundamentally solid and ancient. And at the base of that rock wall, there had been an opening. The opening had been large, easily 20 feet across and 15 feet high, and it had led down into darkness. The creature's trail had led directly to this opening and had disappeared inside. Mark had stood at the entrance for a moment, had realized that he was looking at what was probably the creature's lair, the place where it lived and slept and potentially raised offspring. He'd been thinking about what to do next, had been aware that entering a creature's lair was tactically insane, was the kind of decision that got people killed. But Emma was in there, and he was not leaving without her. Mark had checked his supplies. He'd had almost nothing useful. He'd been on vacation, had not been carrying military equipment, had nothing more than a small flashlight, a pocket knife, and his own physical capability. Against a creature that size, with that kind of power, these things were essentially useless. But he'd entered anyway. He'd stepped into the darkness of the cave, had turned on his flashlight, and had begun moving deeper into the earth, following the sound of something breathing in the darkness ahead, following the faint hope that Emma was still alive, was still recoverable, was still his daughter waiting to be saved. The cave had been vast. The opening had been deceptive, had suggested a simple cave when in reality this was a network of tunnels and chambers that extended deep into the earth. The walls had been smooth in places, suggesting either water erosion or something else, something that Mark's mind had not wanted to consider, that the creature had made these tunnels, had shaped them over time to create a living space. Mark had moved carefully, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, revealing glimpses of the tunnel ahead but leaving most of the space in shadow. He'd been aware of sounds, of movement in the darkness, of the sense that he was being observed even though he couldn't see anything watching him. Then he'd heard it, Emma's voice, faint and distant, calling for him. She'd been alive. She'd been conscious and able to vocalize, which meant she hadn't been immediately killed or consumed. Mark had moved toward the sound, had abandoned caution for speed, had been running through the tunnels toward his daughter's voice. He'd emerged into a larger chamber, and what he'd seen there had stopped him completely. The chamber had been enormous, easily 100 feet across, with a ceiling that rose up into darkness beyond the reach of his flashlight. And in the center of the chamber, on a raised platform of stone that looked almost deliberately constructed, Emma had been sitting. She'd been unharmed. Frightened, certainly, traumatized beyond anything a 10-year-old should experience, but physically intact. She'd seen her father and had started to run toward him, but something had stopped her, had made a sound that was not quite a growl but was clearly a warning. The creature had been there, had been coiled in the darkness at the far end of the chamber, its massive form barely visible in the weak light of Mark's flashlight. It had been watching them, had been aware of Mark's presence from the moment he'd entered the cave, had allowed him to approach this far either out of curiosity or for reasons Mark couldn't begin to understand. Mark had moved slowly toward Emma, had kept his eyes on the creature, had been trying to communicate non-aggression while simultaneously positioning himself to grab his daughter and run if the opportunity presented itself. Emma had been crying, had been reaching for him, but had also been aware of the creature, had been divided between her fear of it and her desperate need to be with her father. When Mark had been perhaps 10 feet from Emma, the creature had moved. It had uncoiled from its resting position, had raised its massive head, and had looked directly at Mark with eyes that reflected his flashlight beam in a way that suggested intelligence, suggested consciousness beyond simple animal awareness. And then it had spoken. Not in words, not in any language Mark recognized, but in a sound that carried meaning, that conveyed something that Mark's mind had interpreted as a question or a challenge. The sound had resonated through the chamber, had vibrated through Mark's body, and for a moment he'd understood something fundamental about what this creature was. It was not simply an animal. It was something else, something that possessed awareness and intelligence and potentially language. It was ancient, had existed in this forest for longer than humans had been in this region, had learned to avoid human contact, had learned to hunt and hide and survive in a world that no longer had space for things like it. And it had taken Emma not to eat her but for some other reason, some purpose that Mark's mind was struggling to understand. Mark had tried to communicate, had raised his hands in a gesture of peace, had spoken aloud even though he'd known the creature couldn't understand his words. He'd told it that he wanted his daughter back, that he meant it no harm, that they would leave and never return to this forest. The creature had tilted its head, had seemed to be considering, and then had made another sound, this one different, this one carrying what Mark had interpreted as something like agreement or understanding. Then it had done something that Mark would never have predicted, never have believed if he hadn't witnessed it himself. The creature had reached out with one of its forelimbs, had picked up something from the floor of the chamber, and had brought it forward. It had been carrying a smaller creature, something that looked like a juvenile version of itself, something that had clearly been injured, had been bleeding from wounds that looked suspiciously like they'd been caused by human weapons. Mark had understood then. The creature had taken Emma not as prey but as a hostage, as leverage, as a way to force a confrontation with a human who might be able to help its offspring. The creature had been desperate, had known that its young one was dying, had understood somehow that humans had medicine, had knowledge, had the ability to help if they chose to. It had been a calculation, a gamble, a desperate parent doing whatever it took to save its child. Mark had recognized it because it was exactly what he was doing, exactly what had driven him to enter this cave knowing he was probably going to die. For a long moment, Mark and the creature had looked at each other, two parents separated by biology and species but connected by the fundamental drive to protect offspring. Then Mark had made his decision. He'd moved forward slowly, had approached the creature despite every instinct screaming at him to run. He'd looked at the injured juvenile, had assessed its wounds with the limited medical training he possessed. The wounds had been serious, had been bleeding steadily, had been the kind of injuries that would be fatal without intervention. Mark had worked carefully, had used what limited supplies he had torn strips from his remaining clothing to create bandages, had applied pressure to stop the bleeding, had done everything his combat first aid training had taught him. The creature had watched, had remained still, had allowed him to work on its offspring even though Mark had been close enough that one movement from the creature could have killed him instantly. It had taken perhaps 30 minutes. When Mark had finished, the juvenile's bleeding had stopped, the wounds had been dressed as well as possible under the circumstances. It was not professional medical treatment, was not going to save the creature's life in the long term, but it had stabilized it, had bought time. The adult creature had made a sound then, something that Mark had interpreted as gratitude or acknowledgement. Then it had moved, had reached down and had gently pushed Emma toward her father. The message had been clear, the exchange was complete. Mark had helped the creature's offspring, and in return, Emma was being released. Mark had grabbed Emma, had pulled her close, had started backing toward the tunnel exit. The creature had watched them go, had not moved to stop them, had simply observed as the two humans had retreated from its chamber. Emma had been crying, had been holding on to her father so tightly she'd been making it difficult for him to move, but she'd been alive, was being returned to him. They'd made it back through the tunnels, had emerged from the cave into the late afternoon light, had stood there for a moment just breathing clean air and feeling sunlight on their faces. Then they'd started moving, had started the long trek back toward civilization, back toward Sarah, back toward safety. The journey out had taken the rest of the day and most of the night. They'd moved as quickly as Emma could manage, had followed the trail back through the forest, had eventually reached the road just as dawn had been breaking. They'd found Sarah there, had found her sitting on a boulder near where the vehicle had been destroyed, waiting for them, having refused to leave even though Mark had told her to get help. The reunion had been emotional, had been overwhelming, had been the kind of moment that makes everything else worth enduring. They'd held each other there on that abandoned forest road, all three of them crying, all three of them alive against impossible odds. They'd walked out together then, had followed the road back through the section that the banner had warned them about, had reached the main road by mid-morning. A passing truck had picked them up, had taken them to the nearest town, where they'd gotten medical treatment and had called the authorities to report what had happened. The authorities had been skeptical, had treated their story as trauma-induced delusion. They'd investigated the destroyed vehicle, had found evidence of an attack but had attributed it to a possible bear or mountain lion, had dismissed Marcus's description of the creature as the product of shock and injury. The locals had known better. The few people in the town who'd been willing to talk about it had confirmed that something lived in that section of forest, something old and dangerous, something that the local indigenous tribes had known about for generations and had learned to respect and avoid. The banner had been put up by locals, not by any official authority, as a warning to outsiders who didn't know the stories, didn't understand what lived in the old forest. Mark and Sarah had taken Emma home, had gotten her professional help to deal with the trauma, had spent months working through what had happened. Emma had nightmares for years afterward, had been changed by the experience in ways both obvious and subtle. But she'd survived, had integrated what had happened into her understanding of the world, had grown into a young woman who knew that reality was far stranger and more dangerous than most people understood. Mark had never returned to that forest, had never again taken his family anywhere near that region. He'd filed official reports with his military command, had tried to convince them to investigate, but his reports had been dismissed or classified, had disappeared into whatever bureaucratic mechanism handles information that challenges accepted reality. But he'd known what he'd seen. He'd known what lived in that forest, had understood that the natural world contained things that science didn't acknowledge, that modernity chose to ignore. He'd been changed by the encounter, had been made aware of his own limitations, had been humbled by the recognition that there were forces and beings in the world that operated beyond human control or understanding. Years later, when Emma had graduated from college, she'd asked him about that vacation, about what had really happened in the forest. Mark had told her everything, had described the creature in detail, had explained what he'd understood about the exchange that had taken place in that cave. Emma had listened, had absorbed the information, and then had said something that Mark had never forgotten: "It was just trying to save its baby, like you were trying to save me." Mark had confirmed that yes, that was exactly what it had been doing. And in that moment of mutual desperation, two intelligent beings from completely different worlds had found a way to communicate, to negotiate, to recognize in each other the fundamental drive that transcends biology and species, the willingness to do whatever it takes to protect offspring. The story of the King of Shadows, as the locals called that creature, continued to be told in the small communities near that forest. Parents used it to warn their children about respecting natural boundaries, about understanding that some places were not meant for human presence. The banner remained in place, updated occasionally when weather damaged it, a permanent reminder that certain warnings should be heeded, that certain boundaries should be respected. Marcus Wellington carried the memory of that encounter for the rest of his life. In his darker moments, when the weight of his military service and the accumulated trauma of his career pressed down on him, he'd find himself thinking about that creature, about its intelligence and desperation, about the choice it had made to take his daughter as leverage rather than simply killing them all. He'd come to understand something important through that experience, that courage and love and desperation existed throughout the natural world, that the drive to protect offspring was universal, that intelligence and awareness were not uniquely human characteristics. The creature in that forest had been as much a parent as Mark himself, had been willing to risk everything, to make desperate gambles, to cross dangerous boundaries in order to save its child. And in the end, both parents had succeeded. The juvenile creature had presumably survived, healed by Mark's crude battlefield medicine enough to give it a chance. Emma had survived, had been returned unharmed to her parents. Two families, separated by biology and evolution by millions of years, had each managed to save their children through a moment of mutual understanding and desperate cooperation. The forest still stood, unchanged by the passage of time, still hiding within its depths things that the modern world refused to acknowledge. The creature still lived there, if it still lived at all, avoiding human contact, protecting its territory, being the kind of apex predator that exists in the margins of human awareness. And somewhere in that vast wilderness, perhaps, there was a juvenile of that species, grown now into an adult, bearing the scars of injuries that should have been fatal but weren't, living proof that sometimes, in the most unlikely circumstances, beings from different worlds can find ways to save each other. The banner still hung there, swaying in the wind, "Do not enter after dusk. Danger zone." Local authorities do not respond. Most people who saw it assumed it was just another warning about difficult road conditions or lack of cell service. But a few, the ones who listened to local stories, the ones who respected old wisdom, understood what it really meant, that there are places in this world where humans are not the dominant species, where ancient things still hold power, where the natural world operates by rules that predate human civilization. Marcus Wellington knew this truth intimately. He'd entered that forest as a father desperate to save his daughter and had emerged with something more, an understanding that the world is far stranger, far more complex, and far more wondrous than the narrow lens of human experience typically acknowledges. He never forgot the King of Shadows, and the King of Shadows, presumably, never forgot him. Two intelligent beings, two desperate parents, connected forever by a moment of mutual vulnerability and mutual salvation, by the recognition that love and desperation and the willingness to sacrifice for offspring are truly universal forces. The story became part of family legend, passed down to Emma's children and eventually to her grandchildren. It was told carefully, with respect for the creature and recognition of the extraordinary nature of what had transpired. It served as a reminder that arrogance and ignorance can be deadly, that warnings exist for reasons, that the natural world deserves respect and caution. And on quiet nights, when the wind moved through the trees and the darkness seemed particularly deep, Mark would sometimes think he could hear it, that distant subsonic rumble, that sound that vibrated through earth and bone, that ancient call that spoke of power and intelligence and survival across time periods that made human civilization look like a momentary blip. The King of Shadows endured, as it had endured for ages beyond human memory, a reminder that we share this world with beings we barely understand, that mystery and wonder and danger still exist in the forgotten places, that some boundaries should never be crossed, and that sometimes, when they are crossed, the results can be both terrible and miraculous. This was the story of what happened when a father entered forbidden territory to save his daughter, when he confronted something beyond his comprehension, when he made a choice that should have resulted in death but instead resulted in an exchange that saved two families across the divide of species and understanding. It was a story of courage and desperation, of love and sacrifice, of the recognition that these qualities are not uniquely human but are instead fundamental forces that shape behavior across the entire spectrum of intelligent life. It was a story that challenged assumptions, that forced a re-evaluation of what it means to be intelligent, to be aware, to be a parent willing to do anything to protect offspring. And it was a story that ended not with triumph or tragedy but with something more complex: mutual survival, mutual respect, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating enemies but from recognizing common ground with beings we initially perceived as threats. The King of Shadows remained in its forest, and the Wellington family returned to their lives forever changed by their encounter with something that should not have existed but did. They carried with them the knowledge that reality is larger and stranger than any framework can contain, that warnings should be heeded, and that sometimes, in the most unlikely circumstances, communication and cooperation can occur across boundaries that seem absolutely insurmountable. The forest stood eternal, the banner continued its warning, and life went on. But for those who knew the story, who understood what had happened in those desperate hours, nothing was quite the same. They looked at the world differently, saw possibilities where others saw only convention, recognized that mystery and wonder still existed in an age that claimed to have explained everything. Marcus Wellington died many years later, an old man surrounded by family, having lived a full life marked by service and sacrifice and love. His last words to Emma, spoken in the hospital room where he lay dying, were about that encounter, about what it had meant, about what it had taught him. "Never forget," he'd said to her, his voice weak but clear, "that we share this world with wonders we barely understand. Respect them. Fear them when appropriate. But never forget that underneath everything, the desire to protect those we love connects all intelligent life. That creature could have killed us. Instead, it asked for help. I hope I gave it enough." Emma had held her father's hand and had assured him that yes, he'd done enough, that both families had survived, that the exchange had been successful. Marcus had smiled then, had closed his eyes, and had slipped away peacefully, his last thoughts perhaps carrying him back to that dark cave, to that moment of connection with something ancient and powerful, to the understanding that had passed between two desperate parents willing to risk everything for their children. The King of Shadows, if it still lived, perhaps remembered that encounter as well. Perhaps, in whatever way such beings process memory and experience, it told its offspring about the human who had entered its lair not to destroy but to help, who had overcome fear and hatred and the instinct for violence in order to save a life. And perhaps, somewhere in the depths of that old forest, the juvenile that Mark had saved grew to adulthood bearing scars that served as a reminder, that not all humans were threats, that not all encounters had to end in violence, that sometimes, rarely, impossibly, understanding could occur across chasms of difference that seemed absolutely unbridgeable. The story ended there, in that recognition, in that moment of mutual understanding that transcended species and biology and evolutionary history. It was a story that suggested hope, that implied possibility, that whispered of a world more complex and more wondrous than humans typically acknowledge. The forbidden jungle remained forbidden. The warning remained in place. The King of Shadows continued its eternal vigil over territory it had claimed long before humans walked this continent. And somewhere, in the memories of a family that had survived an impossible encounter, the story lived on, passed from generation to generation, a reminder of courage and fear and love and the extraordinary things that happen when boundaries are crossed and communication occurs where no communication should be possible. This was the complete story of the King of Shadows, of Marcus Wellington and his family's terrifying vacation, of a father's desperate gamble and a creature's calculated risk, of two families saved through a moment of vulnerability and trust. It was a story that defied easy categorization, that challenged assumptions, that forced recognition of truths uncomfortable to modern sensibilities. And it was a story that, like all true stories of encounters with the unknown, left more questions than answers, more mystery than resolution, more wonder than certainty. In the end, perhaps that was exactly as it should be. Some things should remain mysterious, some boundaries should remain respected, and some stories should end not with complete understanding but with humble recognition that the world contains far more than we can ever fully comprehend. The King of Shadows endured. The Wellington family endured. And somewhere between them, in the space where fear and respect and desperate love intersected, a moment had occurred that neither side would ever forget, a moment that proved that connection was possible even across the most impossible divides, that communication could occur even when no common language existed, that understanding could emerge from circumstances of pure terror and desperation. That moment, that exchange, that impossible cooperation between human and something beyond human categorization, stood as testament to the possibility that intelligence, wherever it emerges, shares certain fundamental characteristics: the drive to survive, the determination to protect offspring, and the capacity, however limited, however desperate, to recognize these qualities in others and to act accordingly. The forest remained. The warning remained. The memory remained. And in the continued existence of all three, the story of the King of Shadows lived on, a reminder that this world is far stranger, far more dangerous, and far more beautiful than we typically dare to acknowledge. The years that followed Marcus Wellington's death were marked by a quiet reverence in the family for what had transpired in that forbidden forest. Emma Wellington, now Dr. Emma Wellingtonchen, had become an anthropologist specializing in indigenous folklore and cryptozoology, her career path shaped entirely by that childhood encounter. She'd spent 2 decades traveling to remote regions, documenting stories of creatures that existed in the margins of human understanding, always searching for patterns, always looking for evidence that what her family had experienced was not unique. Her research had taken her to the Amazon basin, where villagers spoke of the mapinguari, a creature that walked on 2 legs and had claws that could tear through trees. She'd traveled to the Himalayas, where Sherpa guides told stories of the Yeti in tones that suggested they were describing not a legend but a neighbor to be respected and avoided. She documented accounts from the Congo, from Indonesia, from Alaska, from dozens of places where the local population maintained knowledge of beings that science refused to acknowledge. In every case, Emma had found the same patterns: warnings ignored by outsiders, encounters that resulted in death or disappearance, and a small number of survivors whose stories were dismissed as trauma or fabrication. The locals always knew. They always had protocols, had boundaries, had rules that kept them safe. And outsiders, with their confidence in modern technology and their dismissal of traditional knowledge, consistently violated those protocols and paid the price. But Emma had also found something else in her research: stories of communication, of exchange, of moments when humans and these creatures had reached some form of understanding. These stories were rarer, were often incomplete or fragmented, but they existed. A hunter in Borneo who'd encountered an orang pendek and had left offerings of fruit, establishing a kind of truce. A fishing village in Japan that maintained a relationship with something they called the Umi bozu, a sea creature that protected their waters in exchange for respect and restraint in their fishing practices. A tribe in Papua New Guinea that spoke of the ropen, a flying creature that nested in their territory and that they'd learned to coexist with through generations of careful boundary maintenance. These stories suggested something that Emma had come to believe was fundamentally important: that intelligence, wherever it emerged, created the possibility for communication and coexistence. Violence was not inevitable. Understanding was not impossible. But it required humility, required respect, required the recognition that humans were not automatically superior to every other form of life. Emma had written extensively about these ideas, had published papers and given lectures, had built a career on documenting the interface between human and cryptid populations. Her work was controversial, was often dismissed by mainstream academics as pseudoscience or wishful thinking. But she'd built a following among researchers who understood that the natural world was far more complex than conventional biology acknowledged, who recognized that absence of evidence was not evidence of absence, who were willing to consider possibilities that didn't fit neatly into established frameworks. On the 20th anniversary of her grandfather's death, Emma had decided to return to that forest. Not to the exact location where her family's vehicle had been destroyed, she didn't know if she could handle that, but to the region, to the communities that lived near the forbidden territory, to document what they knew and how they'd maintained their relationship with the King of Shadows across generations. She'd prepared carefully for the trip. She'd contacted local indigenous groups, had explained her intentions, had asked permission to visit and document their knowledge. Last stop before entering the deep forest. Emma had checked into the same lodge her family had stayed at, had been surprised to find it still operating under the same ownership. The woman who ran it was older now, was in her 70s, but had remembered the Wellington family, had remembered recommending the scenic loop, had carried guilt about that recommendation for 2 decades. They'd talked for hours that first evening. The lodge owner, whose name was Margaret, had explained what she knew about the creature, about the history of the forest, about the relationship between the local communities and the thing that lived in the deep wilderness. Margaret was not indigenous herself but had married into a local family, had been adopted into their knowledge systems, had been taught what to respect and what to fear. My husband's people have stories about that creature going back 7 generations at least, Margaret had said, sitting across from Emma in the lodge's small dining room. They call it different names. The King of Shadows is what the English speakers call it, but in the original language it's something that translates more like, the Old One who remembers. The idea is that it's been here longer than humans, that it remembers when this was all different, when there were others of its kind, when it wasn't isolated and rare but part of a larger population. Emma had been recording the conversation, had been taking detailed notes. What happened to the others of its kind? Margaret had shrugged. Same thing that happens to any large predator when humans expand their territory. They were hunted, were displaced, were killed off until only isolated populations remained. The stories say there used to be dozens of these creatures in the mountain ranges along the coast. Now there's maybe one, maybe a few, scattered across territories so large they rarely encounter each other. They're functionally extinct, hanging on in the most remote places, hoping humans don't push further into their last refuges. But your husband's people learned to coexist with it. Not coexist, exactly. More like established boundaries. The creature stays in the deep forest, doesn't come near human settlements. Humans respect the warnings, don't enter its territory after dark, don't hunt in certain areas. It's worked for generations because both sides respect the agreement. When outsiders ignore the warnings, like your family did, that's when problems happen. Emma had felt the familiar guilt at that statement. My father was trying to calculate the risk. He thought he had enough daylight. I know. I've thought about that conversation every day for 20 years. I should have been clearer, should have explained that it wasn't about daylight for navigation, it was about daylight as protection. The creature hunts at night, is most active after dusk. During the day it mostly stays hidden, avoids contact. After dark, it owns that forest completely. They'd talked late into the night, Emma absorbing information that filled gaps in her understanding, that added context to her childhood memories. Margaret had been generous with her knowledge, had seemed to feel that Emma had earned the right to understand what had happened to her family. The next morning, Emma had met with representatives from the Yurok group. There had been 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, all in their 50s or 60s, all carrying themselves with the quiet authority of people who were deeply rooted in their culture and traditions. They'd met in a neutral location, a public park in Crescent Mills, and had spent the first hour simply getting to know Emma, assessing her intentions, determining whether she could be trusted with knowledge that had been carefully protected for generations. Emma had been honest with them. She'd explained her research, her career, her motivation for returning to this place. She'd shown them her published work, had demonstrated that she approached indigenous knowledge with respect and seriousness rather than dismissal or appropriation. And she'd shared something she'd never put in her formal writing, how the encounter with the King of Shadows had shaped her entire life, how it had given her a perspective on the natural world that drove everything she did. The eldest of the 3, a man named Thomas, had listened carefully and had finally nodded. Your father did something remarkable that day. He entered the creature's lair expecting to die, expecting to fight, and instead he chose to heal. That act of healing, of recognizing the creature's offspring as a life worth saving rather than as an enemy to be killed, that changed something fundamental about the relationship between that creature and humans. Emma had leaned forward. What do you mean? The creature understands now that some humans can make different choices, can respond to desperate situations with compassion rather than violence. That knowledge is rare among its kind. Most of what they know about humans comes from being hunted, from having their territories invaded, from watching their offspring be killed by people who see them as monsters or trophies. Your father showed it something different. Has there been contact since then? Has anyone else encountered it? Thomas had exchanged glances with his companions before answering. There have been encounters. Fewer attacks, more warnings. The creature seems to have developed a more nuanced understanding of humans. It distinguishes now between people who are threats and people who are simply passing through. There have been situations where hikers got lost in its territory after dark, where 20 years ago they would have been killed, and instead they were herded. Pushed toward the edges of the territory, frightened but not harmed. It's learned that not all humans need to be destroyed. This information had been stunning to Emma. Her father's actions had not just saved his family, they had potentially saved dozens of other people who would have otherwise been killed by a creature defending its territory from what it perceived as an invasion. The woman in the group, whose name was Sarah, a coincidence that Emma found both touching and unnerving, had added something else. We've maintained watch over that creature's territory for as long as our stories remember. It's part of our responsibility as the people who live here, who understand this land. After your family's encounter, we increased that attention, tried to understand what had changed. The creature has been behaving differently. It's still dangerous, still not something to be taken lightly, but it's showing signs of intelligence and decision-making that suggest it understands the value of restraint. Would it be possible to see the territory again? I don't want to enter it, don't want to risk another encounter. But I'd like to see the warning banner, to document how the local communities maintain those boundaries. The three had discussed this among themselves in their own language, a conversation Emma couldn't follow but whose serious tone was obvious. Finally, Thomas had turned back to her. We can take you to the boundary. But you have to understand, going there carries risk even during the day, even with us as guides. The creature is territorial and unpredictable. It might recognize your family connection, might remember what your father did. Or it might see you as a threat. We can't guarantee your safety. Emma had accepted those terms. This was why she'd come, why she'd spent 2 decades preparing herself emotionally and intellectually for this return. She needed to see it again, needed to close some kind of circle that had been opened when she was 10 years old. They'd left that afternoon, 4 of them in a single vehicle, taking back roads that Emma half remembered from her childhood. The landscape triggered memories that were both clear and distorted. She'd been so young, had been so traumatized, that her recollection of specific details was unreliable. But the general feeling of the place, the sense of entering territory that was fundamentally different from the tourist-friendly areas, that she remembered with perfect clarity. They'd driven for perhaps 2 hours, the roads becoming progressively narrower and less maintained, until they'd reached a point that Thomas had indicated was as far as they could safely go by vehicle. From there, they'd walked, following a trail that was barely visible, that required knowledge of the terrain to navigate. Emma had been aware of her guides constantly scanning the environment, constantly assessing threat levels, constantly ready to retreat if conditions changed. After perhaps 40 minutes of walking, they'd reached it, the boundary. The banner was still there, had been maintained and replaced multiple times over the years, but the message remained the same. Do not enter after dusk. Danger zone. Local authorities do not respond. Emma had stood before it for a long time, had reached out to touch the weathered fabric, had felt emotions she couldn't fully name. This was where her father had made his decision, where he'd calculated risk and had gotten it catastrophically wrong. This was the threshold that had separated her childhood from everything that came after. Thomas had stood beside her, had seemed to understand that she needed time to process. After several minutes, he'd spoken quietly. Your father crossed this boundary out of ignorance and arrogance, believing his military training made him qualified to assess threats he didn't understand. But once he was past it, once the situation became desperate, he made different choices. That's what we try to teach people, that if you respect boundaries, you don't have to make those desperate choices. But if you do cross them, if you do find yourself in contact with forces beyond your control, the choices you make in those moments define whether you survive. Emma had turned to look at him. Have you ever seen it? The creature. Once. 30 years ago, before I had children of my own. I was young, was hunting, was farther into its territory than I should have been. It was daytime, but I'd violated other protocols, had disturbed areas that should have been left alone. It showed itself to me, not to attack, but to warn. I saw enough to understand what it was, how powerful it was, how easily it could have killed me. I left immediately, have never made that mistake again. What did it look like? Thomas had considered the question. Describing it is difficult because your mind doesn't want to accept what you're seeing. It's too large, moves in ways that shouldn't be possible, seems to blend with the environment in a way that makes it almost impossible to track visually. But what I remember most is the intelligence in its eyes. This wasn't an animal operating on instinct. This was something that was assessing me, making decisions about whether I was a threat worth engaging with. That intelligence was more frightening than its physical power. They'd spent another hour near the boundary, Emma documenting everything, taking photographs, recording the information her guides were willing to share. The other two had hung back, had maintained a perimeter watch, had clearly been uncomfortable with how close they were to territory they'd spent their lives avoiding. As the sun had begun to sink lower, approaching late afternoon, Thomas had become insistent that they needed to leave. We don't push our luck with the creature. Being here during the day is acceptable, but we don't wait until we're cutting it close. The boundary exists for everyone, including us. They'd made their way back to the vehicle, had driven back to Crescent Mills in relative silence. Emma had been processing what she'd learned, what she'd felt standing at that boundary again after 2 decades. The fear was still there, she doubted it would ever completely leave her, but there was also something else. Understanding. Context. The sense that what had happened to her family, while traumatic and terrifying, was part of a larger story about how humans and the natural world negotiated space and survival. That evening, back at the lodge, Emma had worked on organizing her notes, had begun structuring what she'd learned into a framework that might be publishable. Margaret had brought her dinner, had sat with her while she ate, had continued to share stories and knowledge. There's something else you should know, Margaret had said eventually, her tone suggesting she was sharing something significant. The creature has offspring. Multiple offspring, actually. The one your father saved wasn't the only one, though it may have been the eldest. There are younger ones in that territory now, being raised by the parent, being taught how to survive, how to avoid humans, how to defend their territory when necessary. Emma had put down her pen. How do you know this? Because people see things, even when they're trying to respect boundaries. Hunters who work the edges of that territory have reported seeing smaller versions of the creature, always accompanied by the larger one, always moving through the deep forest. It's reproducing, is maintaining a population, however small. That suggests it's not just surviving but potentially recovering. That's incredibly important. If there's a breeding population, even a small one, that changes everything about how we think about conservation for this species. Margaret had smiled sadly. Except you can't conserve what you can't acknowledge exists. The moment the scientific community officially recognizes these creatures, they become targets, for research, for capture, for exploitation. Right now, their best protection is obscurity, is being dismissed as folklore or imagination. The local communities know this, which is why knowledge is shared carefully, why boundaries are maintained, why stories are told in ways that discourage outside investigation.